Hello and welcome. My name is Torben Ellert. I'm Surface Product Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to this session where we'll be discussing the SharePoint maturity model and, in more overall terms, the challenges and possibilities involved in benchmarking SharePoint to actually establish just how well it's being used. The session will take about 40 minutes, and I'll be focusing on really trying to give you an overview of the specific challenges that we're dealing with here when discussing how to manage SharePoint and how to benchmark it. The key thing here is basically that SharePoint is used in a wide range of different roles, from document management, enterprise content management of various sorts, to intranet and extranet platforms, of course, and obviously also as a website platform. So with this very wide range of usage scenarios, it can be difficult to really track down a specific area where SharePoint is good and a specific area where SharePoint is bad. Of course, that gets made even more complex because within each area, obviously, there are a number of different functionalities, and some of them may be functioning very well, and some of them may be in need of some optimization. So this very wide range of usage scenarios does make it very tricky to sit down and say, in some kind of overall way, our SharePoint is good or our SharePoint is bad. It's almost always going to be the document management works well except for those sites where people don't use the metadata, but it's a good extranet platform, and the confusion goes from that. Now, obviously, we do need to look seriously at this particular challenge because SharePoint has a fairly sizable dollar cost associated with it. Obviously, the visible costs, we all know those: licensing, hardware, setup, consultancy hours, of course. But then the invisible costs, really a major source here that increasingly, I think, we are aware of in the market. But things like, well, what does it cost to actually go from some other system and into SharePoint? Just the costs of user training into new processes, and all of the costs of actually adopting the functionality, even though you've already paid for it. And finally, of course, the really major issue, which is, of course, user uptake of SharePoint. So this brings us to the question that I'm going to be talking about today, and that I hope you'll get a useful answer to, which is, how do you benchmark SharePoint? We'll start off by looking at the SharePoint maturity model, or the SPMM, which is basically a modeling tool that sets up a number of metrics that you can use to consider the various areas of your SharePoint implementation, and then decide where you need to put some effort in and where it's running just fine, thank you. Then we'll look at a practical example of how we can take some of the metrics in the SharePoint maturity model and actually turn those into realizable changes and adaptations to SharePoint. I'll be looking at some concrete examples, some public-facing websites, a couple of internal intranet examples, so you can really see, well, okay, the maturity model says this, but how do I do that in practice? Or what should I be looking for in practice? So let's start off with the SharePoint maturity model as an overall concept. The model itself is based on the capability maturity model, the CMMM or the CMMI, depending on the version of it, something that I'm certain a number of you are familiar with. The key thing here, of course, being the idea that the model sets up areas that are related and then tries to define various levels of maturity or efficacy within each area. So you can actually sit down and look at a specific area and then see almost like a staircase of metrics that you can measure to see how well that particular area is implemented. The model was developed by Sadie VanBuren. You can see her Twitter information there. Do follow her. There's a lot of useful stuff on her website and also in general interaction with the SharePoint community. The model, as she's built it, is holistic in that it doesn't try to establish a single field theory for everything in SharePoint. Rather, it sets up a number of benchmark areas and then tries to break each area down into a scaling a scaling list of metrics. So you can basically see, well, within a specific area, how are things developing. Should be mentioned that it wasn't developed for use on public-facing sites. In my experience of the model, it is applicable, specifically with regards to search, as we'll see, but this is primarily because public-facing websites are not entirely drawing on the full suite of functionality in SharePoint, because if they do, they actually become extranets rather than public-facing sites. Minor difference there, but important to keep in mind, because really the majority of this model is focused on the functionality that's available in SharePoint as an intranet or an extranet. The databases for the model, it goes back over 9 years, over the 3 major SharePoint generations, 3, 7, and 10, of course, and does really contain a lot of data that can give a very good picture of how areas are developing over time, and what areas really do need to be paid attention to, because historically they'll lag. And perhaps best of all, the model is free to use. Obviously, if you agree to share your data back into the community, I would encourage you to do that because it is valuable. Obviously, you can add your data in anonymously so that nothing sensitive comes out, but really just the usage data of where you are with your own SharePoint implementation is enormously valuable because it goes into the massive data and we all can draw on it so that we can see, well, what is the spread of SharePoint maturity like? And taking out of that, of course, where should we be focusing? So, I'd like to just talk through the areas of the SharePoint maturity model, the axes, if you will. And I'll do that by using the Microsoft SharePoint Circle, SharePoint Rosetta, as you can see here, with the 6 key areas of SharePoint functionality. Now, the SharePoint maturity model consists of 3 essential areas. The first is, of course, core, consisting of publication, collaboration, business process, and search, which of course relates to the 4 areas that I've highlighted in the rosette there. And it is really the majority of SharePoint functionality that is within this area. So this is where we'll be focusing for the purposes of this webcast, on those 4 areas. Then there is an advanced area, of course, highlighted as the second section, related to the application platform elements of SharePoint, and of course some of the business insight things. And here we're really talking about integrations, composites, some of the insight functionality that you can get access to with SharePoint. And finally, of course, there's the whole aspect of readiness. This is very much infrastructure related. You can see infrastructure, staffing and training, customizations, things like that. Obviously very important to keep in mind, but it is the core block that we'll be focusing on and looking at for this session. And these areas are, of course, publishing. And here the fundamental question is, how are you delivering your content out to the various user groups that you have within SharePoint? Are you just putting it onto some pages and letting them find it? Or are you using audiences to publish it out in a more structured way? How do you deprovision sites when they're no longer being used? All of those questions related to the push out of data. The second major area, of course, is collaboration. Intranets and extranets, and of course enterprise content management to a certain extent are absolutely key to this. But the fundamental question here is, how do users collaborate within SharePoint, and can they collaborate from outside SharePoint, from outside the organization, perhaps from entirely external systems that aren't SharePoint at all? Business process, another really major one here. Are the various things that you're doing in the organization interlinked? Are they supported by actual processes that are in place within the organization? And can these business processes actually cross out of departments and into other departments, or even entirely out of the organization into external organizations? And the final key area in the core benchmark access is, of course, search. And the fundamental question here is, can you rapidly locate relevant content? As I said, the model draws on the same fundamental ideas as the CMM. The idea that you split out the various areas into escalating levels of competency, or in this case, escalating levels of maturity. It's a 500-point scale, with 100 being the basic level and of course 500 being maximum. Now, let's just run through this really quickly. These aren't split out by the individual areas. I just want to give you an overview of what's included here. Definitely do take your time, take an opportunity to read the model yourself. It goes into much more detail than I'm going to do here. But basically, at the bottom level, we're talking about SharePoint implementations where you're not using taxonomies at all. You only have standard functionalities, really. Standard sites, standard workflows, standard search. And if there are any business processes in place, they will be very poorly defined or ad hoc, really. Something done within a very small group within the organization. Pushing up the scale, at this level we start to see standard properties being used much more actively. Perhaps some custom templates being implemented around about SharePoint to support specific publishing needs, usually. Document versioning begins to become an issue here, where people actually draw on the fact that SharePoint can maintain multiple versions of documents, allowing you to go back in the history of a document and see the changes over time. Also at this level, we start to see user reactive elements within workflows. So for example, a workflow might recognize me, and therefore in the slot in the workflow where my manager should be listed, it would actually go in, look my manager up, and then put their name directly into that slot in the workflow without me having to do it manually. So we start to see SharePoint drawing on its control of the underlying data to make things a little bit easier for me as a user. That's really what maturity is about. At level 300, we start to see managed or custom metadata being used much more aggressively. Those of you who are on SharePoint 2010, this is the level where you start to see the term storm really coming into play. Discussions start to take place within SharePoint, so not just outside SharePoint and then being CC'd into it or mirrored into it or copied into it. You're actually having your discussions within SharePoint, either in terms of wikis and discussion threads, or through perhaps closer integrations with email. We start to see fully reactive workflows where a lot of information is pre-filled based on my role within the organization, based on the underlying data model. And you start to see workflows that will cross department lines, so from human resources and then out into the legal department. Workflows will cross that divide elegantly. In terms of search, this is where you start to see best bets really being used for what they're best at, which is the ability to deliver channeled information outward to users. So for example, something like giving users who are searching for a specific customer name an indication that this customer is a preferred customer, therefore should be treated appropriately. At level 400, we start to see very, very high maturity in place. You start to see document management with full revision support, the ability to move backwards and forwards in documents very, very fluidly, very, very easily. The SharePoint collaboration tools at this level are more or less universally used. So there is very little going on outside of SharePoint. Everything is pushed in and taking place. And email capture is in place by this level. So email is just going straight into SharePoint without having multiple copies or loss of data on the way. Also really important at this level, search becomes adaptive. So search starts to respond to specific users. You start to leverage your custom metadata, custom content types, and search may actually start to provide specific users with specific actions directly connected to what they're looking for. And finally, at the highest level of maturity, basically at this level, you start to see things like fully user-specific content. So single documents that are massively different based on which user is viewing them. A lot of business intelligence stuff taking place at this level, of course. You see workflows that go through firewalls, so people who are running on completely external systems, either external SharePoint farms or Navision or SAP, will start to link into SharePoint, and you'll get workflows that go fluidly through the firewall out to external systems and back again. You also have very, very effective deprovisioning in place. The key thing here is basically avoiding the need to go in and manually remove sites that are no longer relevant. So information end-of-life style things here. And at this level, search is fully scalable. You no longer have to worry about how many tens of millions of documents you've got. The infrastructure will handle it. And you may also see